Welcome back to Unlock, Empower, Transform. I'm Che Blackmon, and if you're just joining us for episode 30, you've picked a powerful one. Today we're talking about something that makes most executives break out in hives: vulnerability in leadership. And before you roll your eyes thinking this is another kumbaya leadership moment, stick with me. We're going to talk about why Dan Campbell can cry at press conferences and still command respect, and how authentic leadership isn't just feel-good fluff. It's a strategic advantage. So let's start with the elephant in the boardroom. How many of you have been told to never let them see you sweat? Or my personal favorite, leave your emotions at the door. Yeah, that worked great in the 1950s when organizations ran like machines and people were treated like cogs. But here's the thing. In today's complex business environment, that armor you're wearing, it's not protecting you. It's isolating you. In my book, High Value Leadership, I dedicate significant space to Dan Campbell's transformation of the Detroit Lions. And listen, as a Detroit girl and lifelong Lions fan, I've lived through decades of heartbreak. I've watched this team through countless losing seasons, through disappointment after disappointment. But what Dan Campbell did with authentic leadership, this is personal for me. I've witnessed the transformation firsthand, and it's a masterclass in vulnerability as strength. This is a coach who literally cried at press conferences, not once, not twice, but regularly showed genuine emotion. And you know what happened? My Lions, our Lions, went from laughingstock to legitimate contenders. The turnaround I've been waiting my entire life to see became reality because of authentic, vulnerable leadership. Now, I can already hear some of you thinking, well, that's sports, Che. That's different. Is it though? Is it really? Because last time I checked, whether you're leading a football team or a Fortune 500 company, you're still leading human beings. And human beings respond to authentic connection, not corporate robots. Let me paint you a picture. There was a manufacturing company in the Midwest, traditional, hierarchical, very command and control. They brought in a new plant manager who decided to try something different. In his first all-hands meeting, instead of the usual PowerPoint about productivity metrics, he talked about his own failures. He shared a story about a previous role where his inability to listen to his team led to a major production error. He owned it vulnerably in front of 200 employees. You know what happened? For the first time in years, people started speaking up in meetings. Safety incidents dropped by 40% in 6 months because workers felt safe reporting near misses. Productivity increased not because of new systems, but because people finally felt seen and heard. That's the vulnerability advantage. But here's where it gets tricky, and this is what I address in my authentic leadership coaching at CBC. Vulnerability without boundaries is just oversharing. Vulnerability without competence is just weakness. The magic happens when you combine authentic emotional expression with strategic thinking and clear boundaries. Dan Campbell didn't just cry and hope for the best. He cried and held people accountable. He showed emotion and made tough personnel decisions. He was vulnerable and maintained high standards. That's the formula. Vulnerability plus competence equals transformational leadership. Think about it this way. When a leader admits they don't have all the answers, what happens? It gives permission for others to contribute. When a leader shares their struggles, it normalizes challenge and growth. When a leader shows appropriate emotion, it creates psychological safety for others to be human. Now, I know some of you are listening to this thinking, Che, I work in finance, or I'm in tech, or my industry doesn't do feelings. First of all, every industry is made up of humans, so yes, your industry does feelings whether it admits it or not. Second, being vulnerable doesn't mean crying in every meeting. It might mean admitting when you're wrong. It might mean asking for help. It might mean sharing a learning moment from a failure. Let me share something from my own journey. Early in my HR career, I thought I had to have all the answers. I was young, black, female. I felt like I had to be twice as perfect to be taken seriously. So I wore this mask of invulnerability, never admitted uncertainty, never showed struggle, never asked for help. And you know what? I was exhausted, isolated, and honestly not that effective. The breakthrough came when I started letting people see my process, not just my outcomes. When I started saying things like, I'm not sure, but here's how we can figure it out together. When I stopped pretending that success was effortless and started showing the work, the struggle, the learning, that's when my influence actually grew. So, how do you actually do this? How do you cultivate what I call strategic vulnerability? Let me give you a quick exercise you can implement today. I call it the 3 T's of authentic leadership. First T, truth. Start your next team meeting with one truth about where you're struggling or learning, not a complaint, not a vent, but a genuine share about growth. I'm learning how to balance strategic thinking with daily operations, and here's what I'm trying. Second T, transparency. Share your decision making process, especially when you're unsure. Here's what I'm considering, here's what I don't know yet, and here's how I'm thinking through it. Third, T, trust. Extend trust by showing trust. Ask for input on something you'd normally decide alone. I typically make this call myself, but I'd value your perspective on. Try one of these in your next interaction. Start small. You don't have to go full Dan Campbell overnight, but watch what happens when you crack open that armor just a bit. Here's what I find fascinating about resistance to vulnerable leadership. We've all been moved by authentic leaders. We remember the coaches who cared, the teachers who saw us, the managers who admitted their mistakes and helped us learn from theirs. Yet when it's our turn to lead, we somehow think we need to be different. We think we need to be invulnerable. But the data doesn't lie. Google's Project Aristotle found psychological safety, which is created through vulnerable leadership, was the number one factor in team effectiveness. Brené Brown's research shows that vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change. My own work in organizational transformation consistently shows that cultures led by authentic, vulnerable leaders outperform those led by perfect ones. And let's talk about the generational shift for a moment. Millennials and Gen Z aren't having it with the old command and control style. They want leaders who are real, who admit mistakes, who show their humanity. If you want to attract and retain top talent, vulnerability isn't optional anymore. It's essential. Now, I want to address something specific for my fellow women leaders, especially women of color. We often face a particular challenge with vulnerability. We're told we need to be strong, that we can't afford to show weakness, that we have to work twice as hard for half the recognition. And there's truth in the systemic challenges we face. But here's what I've learned. Strategic vulnerability is actually a power move. When you control the narrative of your own humanity, you take away others' ability to use it against you. When you own your growth edges, no one can expose them. When you model that strength includes the ability to be vulnerable, you change the game entirely. This is exactly what we dive deep into in my upcoming high-value leadership intensive course. We explore how to cultivate authentic leadership that's both vulnerable and powerful, both genuine and strategic. Because this isn't about choosing between being authentic or being effective. It's about understanding that in today's world, authenticity is effectiveness. As we wrap up today's episode, I want to leave you with this thought. The word vulnerable comes from the Latin vulnerare, meaning to wound. We associate vulnerability with being wounded, being weak. But what if we reframed it? What if vulnerability is actually about being willing to be touched, to be moved, to be changed by our interactions with others? Dan Campbell didn't cry because he was weak. He cried because he cared that much. He showed emotion because the work mattered. He was vulnerable because he understood that leadership isn't about being untouchable. It's about touching others' lives in meaningful ways. Your vulnerability, strategically and authentically expressed, isn't a liability. It's your leadership superpower. It's what makes you relatable, trustable, and ultimately followable. If this resonated with you, I want to invite you to download my Shield Resilience Strategy Guide. It's completely free and includes specific frameworks for building resilience while maintaining authenticity. You'll find a whole section on emotional intelligence and creating psychological safety through vulnerable leadership. The link is in the show notes. And please drop a comment below. Tell me about a time when a leader's vulnerability made a positive impact on you, or share your own experience with authentic leadership. Let's normalize these conversations. Join me Thursday for episode 31, where we're talking about crisis as catalyst, turning setbacks into comebacks. We'll explore how the best leaders don't just survive crises, they use them as transformation accelerators. Trust me, you won't want to miss this one. Until then, remember, your authenticity isn't a weakness to hide, it's a strength to leverage. Lead with your whole self, because that's the only way to create whole organizations. This is Che Blackmon reminding you that transformation starts with truth, and truth starts with you.